I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Timiebi Aganaba, currently an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at ASU, with a courtesy appointment at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. Perfect. Timmy is an expert in all things space law. Her journey into the field started when she was posted to the Nigerian Space Agency after finishing her law degree in 2006. She then went on to a master's in space management at the International Space University, where she was bitten by the transdisciplinary bug. Timmy got her master's in law and then her PhD at the McGill Institute of Air and Space Law, with a thesis on the cosmopolitan approaches to international law, finding the right lens to view the freedom of outer space. She then did her postdoc at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, where she focused on environmental governance. She's also been a space industry consultant and executive director of the World Space Week Association. Timmy's also very active in outreach. She produced and hosted the 12-episode Ladies Do Launch podcast and is involved in various initiatives to attract African youth to the field. In 2018, she joined the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at ASU as an assistant professor, where she has since launched the Space Governance Lab concept. Now I'll pass the floor to Timmy, who's going to tell us today about the emerging Space 5.0 era and the role ethics, governance, and law have to play. The floor is yours, Timmy.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me. Am I on mute? Nope, you can hear me, right?
Oh, I think we can't hear you.
I'm not. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, perfect. So it's my honor and my pleasure to be here today. So I'm a professor of space and society at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. Maybe even the first one with that title. But what does that mean? So I see that science and society is a thing. I mean, Google says so. And Dr. Alondra Nelson, for instance, in the US, is the Deputy Director of Science and Society at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. And during a 16th of January 2021 event at which President Biden introduced his team, Nelson acknowledged the challenges ahead, and she said, "Never before in living memory have the connections between our scientific world and our social world been quite so stark as they are today." She said, "I believe we have a responsibility to work together to make sure that our science and technology reflects us." So maybe I'm the aspirational Alondra Nelson for space. Not just because we are both Black females, but because I'm in the business of looking at human social behavior, patterns of social relationships, social interaction, and culture that surrounds our interaction with space exploration and use. And I do this through the lens of law, governance, policy, and ethics. But the thesis that I put to you is that what goes on in space and in Earth, the similarities and differences and the connections between the domains, is a complex system problem. In my TEDx talk titled The Future of the Space 4.0 Era, if you watched it, I ended with my favorite quote from Joey Esrich and Ed Finn. And they say space is not a void, but a canvas for the human imagination. Questions of policy and logistics are merely scaffolding for a deeper set of questions about who we are and who we want to be as a species. We explore the universe not just because we are curious, but because of what that curiosity will do to us and how we will grow to match our expanding sphere of influence and understanding. But now I'm asking, is a canvas the right metaphor for space, or is it actually a mirror? In each case, what you see is a reflection of who you are, either as a creator to paint the canvas or who you are reflected as a mirror. And for many space enthusiasts, they look at space as a blank slate to reinvent humanity. But what I'm asking is, how do the discussions about space actually reflect what goes on legally, socially? It could be a mirror as to what goes on here. But because the history of man's use of space is short, there are limited past dependencies, and so we can actually use the discourse to reimagine the future. Now, if I analogize our interaction with space as a mirror, where we are now in the age where space has officially been declared a war-fighting domain, just like all the other domains, heralding space forces around the world to defend space interests, it's important to ask, How did you get to the space endeavor as an individual? What was your journey? What drives your thinking and the narratives that you have about space? So how did I get here? I mean, scientists and many others don't like the use of the word I, the focus on the self. It screams subjectivity. It's not scalable or replicable. Yet, Judith Butler says we must take account of oneself. So who am I and why should you care? Born and raised in the United Kingdom, I grew up in a small town where I was the only Black kid in school. But I didn't notice. My dad did a really good job of shielding me from all the racism that he experienced on a regular basis. And I didn't internalize my difference. In fact, though I wanted to be a lawyer, I also wanted to work for the British Foreign Service, promoting British interests worldwide. After my undergraduate degree at the University of Leicester, I realized that I had a warped sense of self. I had no sense of what it meant to be an African, to be a Nigerian. So I decided to go to law school in Nigeria. And that was the single most influential decision I've made in my life. I finally saw that I was Black. I finally saw what I'd been missing my whole life. I suddenly found myself. Now, when you graduate in Nigeria, you have to do a year's service for the country. It's called the National Youth Service. And I was lucky enough to be posted to the Nigerian Space Agency in the newly created Department of Legal Affairs and International Cooperation. Now, I didn't know what I got myself into, but that was the second most influential and impactful decision that I made in my life. When I would tell people I worked at the Nigerian Space Agency, I would be shocked at their visceral reaction. You know, we don't even have steady electricity supply, and you're talking about going to space. But that's when I realized I was onto something. What is this space thing really about? How do people benefit from this? Why should anyone care about this when there are more pressing and important things to do? And from a policy standpoint, how can the Nigerian space program find friends internationally when people will say that our priorities are misaligned? For this audience here today, it goes without saying that we realize that the basic answer is that space exploration and utilization is necessity. Satellites, which use the medium of space, are part of our basic infrastructure in a functioning society. And if we had to imagine a day without satellites, according to Moriba Jah, here are just some effects. TV broadcasts by satellite would be disrupted. Those traveling by sea, air, and land would be grounded. Stoplights would stop synchronizing. The world economy would shut down because timestamps keep track of everything. Most countries would declare a state of emergency and call upon the military to restore order. And they would wonder if it was the result of a hostile attack. And who knows what kind of decisions would be made with limited information. But of course, like most of the general public, I did not know all these. So to answer these questions, I went on an academic sojourn that took me to the International Space University in France for my Master of Science in Space Program Management, and to McGill for my Master's and PhD in Space Law. Following graduation, I completed my postdoc on climate change at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, and suddenly found myself hired as a professor of space and society at the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. But I had no idea what that meant, the School for the Future of Innovation and Society. What was I supposed to do, predict the future? 3 years in, what I've come to realize is that I'm not in the game of predicting the future. I just double down when I see the future is already here. That future that I alluded to in my 2019 TEDx talk on the future of the Space 4.0 era is here. So what were the other 4 eras as conceptualized by the European Space Agency? If you watch my TED talk, you'll see that the first era of space is Space 1.0. And this can be considered to be the early study of astronomy and even astrology. The next era, Space 2.0, came about with spacefaring nations engaging in a space race that led to the Apollo moon landings. The third era, Space 3.0, with the conception of the International Space Station, showed that we understood and valued space as the next frontier for cooperation and exploitation. Space 4.0, a time when space is evolving from being the preserve of the governments of a few spacefaring nations to a situation in which there is an increased number of diverse space actors around the world, including the emergence of private companies, participation with academia, industry and citizens, digitalization, and global interaction. According to Danny Bednar of Western University, who first recognized that we are in the Space 5.0 era, he posited that what has been less discussed in the conception of these eras, if they are indeed meaningful labels we wish to accept, is the ramification of such expansion of space activities and inclusion of actors with broader values. Herein lies the idea of Space 5.0 era as the ethics era. Now, from my lens of law and governance, and from my observations of social movements, I see that the Space 5.0 era is marked by a move towards social transformation. So as a lawyer and a theorist, what does social transformation mean? Back in 2010, I took a class with McGill law professor Richard Jander called Theoretical Approaches to Law. And he asked us in a class, what is the relationship between social transformation and the law? The first thing that I thought was that there is a debate as to whether legal change follows social transformation or vice versa, and whether law is an active or passive force for change. At that time, it was clear to me that the task of social transformation, whether through the law or any other medium, had become more difficult today. And I argued that it's because the system has very successfully conditioned society. So Roberta Unger's work is very relevant today because it seeks to question how we can move forward in today's apathetic world, whilst theories of the past have sought to propose diametrically opposed systems or offered radical ideas for how society should be organized and governed. But looking at the works of other noted philosophers, 2 points stood out to me. Firstly, there's a need to overcome the alienation that separates self from self, as well as self from others. And there is a need to connect the inner and the outer aspects of our social existence. So Hegel, in his rather confusing way, dealt with this issue of self-realization and individual freedom. His ideas open the door to many others to the extent that the core message that we can take away is the understanding of the role of the individual in society and the realization that he or she can in their own way personally influence societal change and the law. Judith Butler's theory is also fundamental to unleashing the individual's capacity to know himself and use his understanding of himself for the good. The second point philosophically is that there's a need to understand the past, our influences, and the symbols and behaviors we are conditioned to understand and respond to. So Foucault touched upon discipline and how society can be conditioned without even knowing it. The understanding of the far-reaching and frightening prospect of this is fundamental to the goal of social transformation because it highlights how all concepts or ideas for social transformation can be used in the negative sense to either maintain the status quo or to create change for worse, depending on who is looking for change. Derrida explained the need to understand and show reverence and acknowledgement to the past, as did Negri and Hart, who argued that the need to understand our heritage and that our society has already shaped us to the extent that potentially any new ideas we have may come from that society that we are trying to change. And the initial ideas from the original empire may be strong enough to creep into our new consciousness, such that we think what are new ideas are just old ideas explained in a different way. There are many other insights that I gained from my study at McGill, but probably the central contribution to my understanding of social transformation comes from Duncan Kennedy, whose thesis is that the main barrier to social transformation is the reification and fetishization of the law within society. My understanding of his argument is that the pretense that law is determinate mystifies social life, encouraging people to think that the practices codified in law have fixed and frozen what they can hope to achieve. And so long as their rights are protected, they can't complain, thus discouraging them from political action aimed at transforming the content of rights so as to realize the emancipatory potential of law. In this sense, society itself can use the law to change the law and transform society, but the law can also be used to trap society into thinking that it cannot be changed. So with this understanding that by understanding ourselves and the power inherent within us, we can look at the prevailing trends in the Space 5.0 era, which have law, governance, and ethics at the center. I also have some of the leading emerging thinkers on these topics here with me to discuss how these trends have come about. So the first trend that I'm really looking at is resisting the structures of coloniality. This is not just about inclusion and opening the door a little, but rethinking the narratives and foundations of space exploration, its why, and the place of different stakeholders. Concurrently, though, as the future is for all, the approach needs to be centered on a thought-out cosmopolitanism that recognizes common and differentiated obligations and benefits for humanity. Dr. Natalie Trevino's work introduced me to this viewpoint, even though people have been discussing this since the beginning of the space age. Dr. Natalie Trevino, who's here, is a space theoretician and award-winning educator who recently graduated from the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism at Western University in London, Ontario. Her research focuses on how the colonial legacy within space exploration limits the possibilities of futures in space. The second trend is really the need to mainstream the concepts that apply to space and to realize that this era of exceptionalism in space must be over if it's to scale. So in the legal context, I'm talking about the application of principles of general areas of terrestrial law to the space domain. For instance, what is the place of individuals and human rights as we start thinking seriously about space settlement? And how do we think of space as an environment that requires sustainable development, requiring the application of environmental law standards? To discuss this, I've invited Christian van Eyck, who is an international lawyer based at the University of Cambridge. He holds an LLM in Public International Law and a BA in International Justice from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Chris researches space governance from a third world historical perspective, as well as how other parts of international law, like environmental law and human rights law, function in space. And he hopes to begin a PhD based on this research later this year. The third trend is really that it may be that it's coalitions or groupings of states that will be leading exploration. If so, then what are the applicable principles of polycentric governance that apply? As the United States-led Artemis Accord may need to be applied alongside a Chinese-Russian-led governance system, how do we interact between legal orders? Could there even be a non-aligned movement too, made up of non-state actors focused on organizing and governing themselves through transactions, contract, and private law principles? Lucas Kern has been working on this. Lucas is a recent graduate from ASU's double degree master in global sustainability science, where he focused on transdisciplinary and participative governance. He's currently part of a working group that explores polycentricity to govern the diversity and complexity of lunar goods and resources. But importantly, what does this all mean to us here on the ground, on the micro scale? I think it calls for a move towards operationalizing equity and thinking about this practically. We must look at the concept of fairness in international law, which is focused on procedure, but procedure that does not look at context or the outcomes is bad. So we need to bring sociology into law. And this calls for a focus on justice and interpretation, which is beyond the law. Dr. Alessandra Marino has been doing significant work in this area. She's a research fellow in international development within Astrobiology Open University, and her interests span critical development studies, issues of justice, equality, and ethics. She's co-PI of the UK Space Agency-funded project DETECT that uses space technologies for malaria control in Guyana. And her research on space technologies used in international development programs tries to understand how effective these are at changing people's lives. She also explores how post-colonial and decolonial studies can contribute to current debates on knowledge production and research methods in astrobiology and related disciplines. So I invite these four researchers onto the stage. And at this point, anyone in the audience can feel free to chime in with any questions that you may have, because we want this to be interactive. But Natalie, perhaps you can start off. People will be very confused when they hear about coloniality, because they think there cannot be colonialism in space. There is no history. But you distinguish between coloniality as logic and colonialism as practice. So can we hear a bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. So the biggest difference between colonialism and coloniality is that colonialism is an imperial practice. It is the acquisition and invasion of foreign lands, with the intent to exploit and dominate an indigenous peoples or resources in some way, where coloniality actually is the logic behind that. So you can think about it in the same way that there is like inductive logic. It is a way of operating that produces certain forms of governance, law, culture, and understanding the self. So initially, this theory of coloniality came out of the global South, mostly from Latin America, where it was used to express and explain the domains of life that had been transformed and continuously impacted by colonialism, even after the formal end of colonization. So what those domains are governance, knowledge production, identity, sense of self, so gender, race, sex, and the economy, so distribution and redistribution of goods, but nature falls into this category. So what does all this have to do with space? Well, when we look at the narratives around space exploration, especially in the North American or Western context, we often talk about space as the final frontier, or going into space to mine. It's a new gold rush. It's a new age of discovery. And a lot of times these narratives come from what we oftentimes in the global North would say it was the age of discovery, but in reality, it was actually the age of exploitation and genocide. And that legacy can't be separated from what we've built. So when we're looking into space and we're saying that Mars is the next frontier, what are we actually saying here? And how is that relaying a tendency towards over dictating what we'll be doing on Mars? So what this actually does is coloniality within space exploration limits our ideas about the possibilities of the future, and in fact makes it so that there's only one way of thinking about the world, and that is, or all the worlds, and that actually comes through the logic of coloniality. In my work, I specifically looked at American space policy and hope to continue doing that work in the future. But what I found was even the use of rhetoric, like frontier rhetoric, as I called it, ended up operationalizing ideas about what we could do in space, who could go into space, and why we were even bothering to go into space to begin with, that oftentimes lead only towards exploitation and dominance rather than opening up the entire possibilities of the world. And so really kind of looking for the colonial logic within space exploration allows us to remove those elements and then open up the entire universe of space exploration, which is all what we want anyways, right? We are those people who are interested in the expanding universe and want to see it. So why would we limit our thinking, even unintentionally, about what it is that's possible?
And I think it's really interesting that you highlight that, because since I started talking about your work and coloniality, the criticism is that people automatically assume that you're trying to stop things happening, and it's like, no, it's this mindset that it is about a logic and approach that you're taking towards what you're doing. And there are people, everyone on this panel is pro-space, we're pro-space development, but it's just making sure that people reflect back and realize, what it is that they're doing. So, next, Chris, your work is fascinating, arguing that general international lawyers need to look up more and think about how their work applies in the space context. You also have some interesting myths about space governance that really symbolizes and expresses where people are going wrong in their thinking. So please share some of your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, so sort of jumping off from where Natalie left us, my research looks at, well, what I've called the three main dominant myths of space governance right now. And these are, in brief, that there is no relevant history, that there's no direct victims, and that there is no effective law in space, so no history, victims, or law. So in each case, they are not at all bounded in fact, but more presumptions we make. And moreover, they sort of influence each other in a way that leads to a situation where the futures we can imagine are indeed limited in that way. And so I think in each case, we need to get over that each one as an obstacle to broadening up the space governance 5.0 we want to see in the future. So on the first count, there is no relevant history. A good example of this, when I'm looking at space discourse now, I see a lot of this presumption of novelty, right? That everything that we're doing in space is the first time anyone's tried to do it. And you see this, for instance, looking at corporate space actors. People think, well, the situation we have now in space is clearly something that was never imagined by the people who drafted the space laws that we have now from the 1960s and 70s. But of course, that wasn't true because the people who drafted the outer space treaties that we call outdated had just themselves, in some cases, been freed from decades or centuries of colonialism impacted by corporate actors themselves. They very much understood the threat of a corporation and the fact that that could be sort of a tool of colonial power. So in fact, if you look at the historical record of the meetings that drafted those treaties, which I've been doing extensively, you see frequent references to corporate space activity and whether or not it should be allowed or not. I'm not saying that it's not allowed now, but the idea of trying to paint the present as something that the past could not have imagined at all is only one sort of further limitation of the futures we have ahead of us. It also stops us from seeing the histories that we bring to space with us. As Timmy said, like when we look up, it's a mirror is a good example. It shows us ourselves. The first thing we did when we went to orbit is start Earth imaging and a whole new way of viewing our planet. There's a reason the blue marble is one of the most viewed images. But when we go up there and see ourselves and learn more about ourselves, we're also bringing a lot of history. And if we don't understand that, it becomes problematic. There's also the idea of having no direct victimhood in space because there isn't sort of an indigenous population there that we know of, at least in our neighborhood. But as we know, Natalie just explained, coloniality itself as a way of thinking is harmful. It leads to harm in some way or other. The way that we think about the environment and people or others as objects for consumption is not something that leads itself to prosperity for all involved. In this case, you can think, sure, there's no indigenous peoples we may be directly harming, but what about global South states now? What about future peoples later? The way that we use space resources, I don't just mean mining, but also orbits, which are legally resources, changes a lot of the futures that they can imagine. Will they be able to launch the Starlinks in the future if we've already contaminated the orbits that are best for that? And then finally is the myth that there isn't an effective law, which sort of leads from the first two. People love to sort of deride the space treaties as being outdated or objects of the past. And of course, we need updated law as well. Luckily, international law has provided for that because it's not just the black and white words on paper. In international law, the practice of enacting law can itself become law through custom. There are sort of ways of making law that are not just explicit words on paper, which is, I don't think, enough considered in space governance. And of course, sort of the final point is international law itself has obviously developed quite a bit since the 60s. We have a much bigger toolbox here on Earth to dealing with problems like this, but the people who are holding those tools aren't necessarily looking that far up. So when we talk about environmental law, especially procedural aspects like environmental impact assessment, we see sort of a split. People on Earth are doing one thing. People in space are also talking about sustainability, impact assessment, but the conversations aren't necessarily happening to make sure they're on the same level. And for human rights law, the right to environment, although not something that can be claimed in court in every country or jurisdiction, has still been a really effective solidarity mechanism for indigenous peoples especially, but all throughout the global South, and could be a very interesting way of looking at developing a sense of orbital citizenship, at least sort of for how we're using orbit now, which is what I look at. Ultimately, awesome. The idea of enforcing existing law helps to improve legal certainty and predictability in orbit. And just to conclude here, space is not the Wild West, and we really have to use the rules we've got at home before we go out and buy new ones.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And you end that on a powerful note because we always hear that space is the Wild, Wild West. But I wanted to bring Lucas in the conversation because we understand why people call it the Wild, Wild West because, like you said, the effectiveness of the application of general principles of international law has not appeared to be that, effective or or, utilize. And so, Lucas, we were talking about polycentric governance, which I would like you to explain. But I think from the legal standpoint, what we're seeing is the US, the US were really leading this coalition approach and saying, us and our allies are going to go to the moon, we're going to explore together, and we're going to take this law that we've created to govern our relationship with us, the Artemis Accords. But as these coalitions are starting up doing their own thing, does that mean there's just going to be governance regimes everywhere? So can you tell us a little bit about, this trend of polycentric governance and whether it may or may not lead to strengthened centralized institutions in the end?
Certainly, I can try. And I think effectiveness is exactly the right word. So if I look out my window and it's night, I'm in Europe right now, or in fact my background, I see the stars and kind of infinity actually, and also the infinity of possible interactions with that space. So I'm wondering, how can one set of rules govern that infinity of interactions with space? Or how can one group of people devise a handful of rules for all these interactions? And that is monocentricity. Monocentricity is one governance center that creates rules that governs everything. On the other hand, polycentricity is consists of multiple semi-independent governance centers with the capacity and authority to make up their own rules, because they're bound by one overarching diffuse set of rules that authorizes them, but that also guides them in how to devise their own rules and how to be autonomous. And that creates spontaneity, because those actors can interact between each other. They can make up their own rules, they can be spontaneous, they can create innovative space governance in that sense. And through their interactions and the exchange of those innovative rules, they can in fact create broader rules or exchange those rules to create a new, larger system, like Timmy said. So what I'm looking for in my work right now is to create a conversation about how polycentricity can create effective and sustainable and also practical lunar governance. And I'm focusing on lunar governance here. Basically, what we have to consider in making up lunar governance or space governance in general is space and the moon are highly diverse, and so are the interests. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what there is on the moon or in space and what the interactions with those resources or goods can be. So from my sustainability background, I know that polycentricity is really good at addressing uncertainty and complexity, because again, it's adaptable, it's innovative, it's spontaneous, and it creates transparency and communication between the actors. And also, the moon as itself kind of is very conducive for self-governance, just because of the physical aspects of the remoteness of the nature of space. It's very conducive. It fosters collective action between the actors. So again, that for me kind of asks for a polycentric approach to kind of govern that diversity and all the challenges space brings. So we're
but I think that the interesting thing is when we think from the perspective of coloniality, because your topic is a little bit off that, because it's kind of saying these actors can come in, they can be flexible, but that doesn't take into consideration like the power struggles that would be inherent in the different groups that come in. So like, for instance, Chris, what are some of your thoughts on like this idea of, separate nodes of governance and what, like, I think a lot of us space lawyers even do question, do we need a top-down system to actually be able to coordinate it all?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people imagine law as being a top-down system because because it seems like like we've been handed these treaties, and sort of there are a bunch of lawyers that are kind of standing there holding them to, yelling, "We have to follow these. These are the rules, and there is no changing." And sort of, this is the situation you were given. But like I said, law is a changing, living thing, especially international law, especially on the environment and our rights. It's changing quite fast, actually. So the idea of something that's polycentric, or in international law, we talk about regional custom as well. People love to use the word fragmentation. I don't always know if it's a bad thing that we have different standards for different peoples and places, but I think it's important that we recognize how each system is talking to each other, and that we have some idea of general standards, right? We don't want corporations to use space as a tax haven or a place where labor laws don't work, for instance. There needs to be some, conversations going on, even among systems that, like, I feel that they're separate, to enact some idea of dignity and humanity, like international law functions on.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because maybe any of you can speak to this. John Rummel's question that says, what is missing from the Artemis Accords? So the Artemis Accords is an executive political agreement between 9 countries led by the US about how they're going to explore space. And, he basically says the Artemis Accords don't contain a significant reference to Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which calls for preventing harmful contamination. So defining harmful contamination fully is a challenge, but preventing it brings in expensive requirements on space actors. So, maybe any of you can chime in on this idea of, if we're trying to say there is something called fairness, and maybe I can bring Alessandra into this. If we're talking about fairness and we're talking about bringing in diverse actors, do the standards get lower? Is it you know what I mean? And you actually work with lots of diverse actors, so maybe you can actually bring us into this concept of operationalizing equity and how we can actually, create an environment where everyone can come to the table. Floor is yours.
Well, it's interesting because this brings kind of like the dual perspectives together, and, like the macro perspective of international law and how do we access these conversations from multiple points of view and multiple standpoints. And I very much agree with the fact that Article 9 needs kind of international cooperation and does need a framework. First of all, for the definition of what is harmful. And what is harmful, if we look at it from the perspective of coloniality, I'm pretty sure Natalie will have a few things to say in terms of the modification of environments for exploitation of resources and how that created harmful effects historically on our planet. So I think these are things that we need to keep in mind when we are trying to think about this new era of space exploration. My personal kind of way into these debates is kind of like on the smaller scale. So I was wondering if Natalie wanted to say something specific about that question, or someone else, before I move forward on operationalizing equity.
Go ahead, Chris. Natalie.
Oh, sorry. I can definitely say that defining things in not just space law and policy, but in the space community as a whole, that's where a lot of interesting conversations can come up, because, right, according to the lens that I'm putting out there, coloniality as a logic, the mass colonization of North and South America during the 16th century started climate change, which is in itself harmful. So do we, how do we deal with that sort of thing? And so at what scale are we talking about harm, and whose harm, and in what way? Is putting possible bacteria or bringing bacteria from space in some way harmful to us if it can change things? I recently was thinking about the cats in Australia, where they had to basically call a bunch of cats because of how, they were basically taking over the country. And then 10 months later, they're like, well, shoot, now we have all these rodents. So we have to, harm in itself is very hard to pinned down, but that's why it needs to be a constant conversation. It can't be something that's rigid, that this is what it is forever. And that's where I think, the living body of law can really have something to say.
Go ahead,
If I could just briefly jump in there on that point. So this is a really good question, and a lot of people way smarter than me have written very, very good things about it. But generally speaking, this is where customary international law and the subsequent developments that we've seen since the space treaty can come in handy, right? Because environmental law, although environmentalism was sort of burgeoning and very much on the minds of the drafters at the time, it wasn't, the legal kind of regime wasn't there yet. And so we have to read it in line with sort of the standards of now. And there's a significant line of environmental case law which says that standards like harm change alongside the changes we see to the norms in science since they were written, especially in treaty implementation like this case. But I have to say that harm, especially in commons or areas beyond national jurisdiction, is still fuzzy because it's not clear, because it hasn't really been used, which is not a great excuse, I think. And especially problematic is who has standing, what countries can claim. Is it a country whose satellites directly are hurt by this, or is it something the whole international community can claim, what's called erga omnes? Is that obligation erga omnes, rather? It's sort of, to make it operational, there's just some little gaps, just need to we need a bridge. And that's why it's frustrating to me that this isn't being discussed more within terrestrial environmental law.
Awesome. So Alessandra, maybe we can have you give your points about operationalizing equity. So in the US, that an executive order came out by the president that basically said you have to take a whole of government approach to equity. Like everyone has to start thinking about equity. And I think people must just have their arms in the air, because people are like, what does equity mean? Isn't that we have these debates about equality versus equity? And even if we have a conversation, like say these discussions we've been having about diversity and inclusion, how do you actually operationalize it beyond doing, things that are just lip service? So what is your experience from that?
That's a great question, and thank you very much. I'll just start by giving a little bit of my thoughts generally on this area of equality. And I work on space technologies on Earth from a social science perspective. So in my view is like my way of entering into these debates is trying to bring the conversation home to the familiar spaces. And I ask myself in my work and in my collaborative work, what are the consequences of thinking about this entanglement of Earth and space in the reproduction of historical inequalities? So if we take this coloniality approach, if we take that further, what does it actually mean in practice? And how do we do things differently? How can we kind of enter into this space differently? So this question is at the very heart of my work in astrobiology, because I work in an interdisciplinary astrobiology unit, and I'm based in the UK. So located in the global north and very much in one of the centers of colonial and imperial history. So when I say we, and sometimes I do say we, please bear with me. What I'm talking about is the subject position of someone that's located in the global north and is working through our own biases. So hopefully some of that will resonate with you. And within my unit, my intervention has really been about highlighting that ethical space exploration must start with just and equitable practices on Earth, during fieldwork in analog sites, for example, but also in our labs and in our offices. So I'll briefly touch on 3 areas where I see more equitable practices are needed. And these are fieldwork, particularly when it's in analog sites and particularly in the global south, partnerships, and approaches to science. So I'll just spend a couple of words on each of them. In relation to fieldwork, I see that there is a great need for ethical frameworks for fieldwork in analog sites that must be drawn to include potential impacts of the project on local communities and avoid that kind of often found pitfall of assuming that extreme environments on our planet are not inhabited. So here I want to go back to coloniality, because that's what enables researchers, particularly from the global north, to assume that extreme environments are terra nullius. For more on this point, I'll just direct you to read Linda Tway-Smith's work on decolonizing methodologies, because it says it all. On partnerships, in our project, it's important to think about equitability in terms of share of resources, whose voices are heard, and who publishes, and who collects the data. Are there equitable practices in the ways in which your projects are run? Are conversation being had about that? And finally, in relation to science, there is a longer conversation here that I can't really summarize, but science is built very much on European knowledge and values, and has historically been predatory upon indigenous knowledges. And someone like Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls literally epistemicide the sort of approach that European colonialism has had towards indigenous knowledges. So I suggest asking, what sort of assumptions underpin our scientific practices, and what type of knowledges we value? So just my final word is, if we accept that there is some revolutionary potential in changing what is familiar to us, we can all start from our projects, our relationships, our knowledge, and dream about ways of doing space science differently.
Fantastic. You just set us up to open it up to the audience, because this is very relevant to the work that everyone is doing here. Most of the people here are scientists and lawyers, and thinking about ethical practices in our work is all very relevant. So I see Emma McKay has a question. Go ahead, Emma.
Hi, thanks for this really lovely panel. Alessandra, I especially appreciate the idea that equity in space is closely tied to, or indeed begins with, equity on Earth. With that, I'm coming to you as a person who researches the relationship of STS and physics and extraction, and in particular, the ways that material technologies are tied up in extraction because they're made of materials that have been extracted. So whenever I think about space exploration, I think about all of the piles of materials, including jet fuel and metals of some dozens of different kinds that have to be extracted, smelted, manufactured in order to make technologies to bring people and objects off of the surface of our only planet. I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts on how to respond to the colonialism of extraction, and indeed the inherent violence of extraction, which is so colonial that is unavoidable in, or seems to me at least unavoidable in the production of in the use of space technologies.
Go ahead, Alessandra.
I'll just say a few words without responding to Emma's really important question, because I find it like incredibly big, and I know Natalie is like on it and she will do that work, I know that. But first of all, I want to thank you for bringing that up. And one thing I would like to say is that in this space, and particularly in the field of space exploration, space research, and space governance, I've heard coloniality being talked about very much as only a mindset. And I don't think that's the case. And what your question brings up is how coloniality is about structures and structural relationships. And this is a really important point that we need to keep in mind. So my approach in terms of like talking about equity goes alongside challenging structures not in its place. But I know Natalie will say much more.
Thank you for that question. It's fantastic, because I think one of the ways in which the logic of coloniality kind of is insipid and just kind of digs itself in is we assume that the only way for there to be utilization is through exploitation and extractivism. And really, what being like coming from like an anti-colonial or decoloniality stance isn't so much that we would stop building these things or stop doing these things, as much as they would be tempered to be inclusive to the peoples and the ways of life that really come out of the areas where we're mining a lot of the world, basically. I always go back to this example, so people who've heard me talk before, please just ignore this. But when we think about extractivism, I always go back to Elon Musk's tweet when he talks about the fact that he can coup whoever he wants to get lithium for his batteries, right? And he is going, and this was in reference to the anti-democratic coup in Bolivia. Now, this is a direct attack on a sovereign nation, and saying that we can, just do whatever we want to do because I have the money, the wealth, and the power to do it. And if there's the material there, then I can take it in some way. Well, what this actually does is it removes us from this point of space for the benefit of all humankind and saying, well, not for the Bolivians. So what do we do? It's not that we can't make batteries. It's that perhaps we ought to be thinking about this in a way and moving in a way where some of these extractivist practices, instead of being for profit and for the mass consumption, then is saying, what are we actually doing here and what do we need? So it's actually about making infrastructure, saying, okay, what, instead of just mass appropriation, what are we trying to do here? And that's a hugely different way of thinking about it, because it involves planning, it involves like polycentric like governance, it involves international law, and it's actually a harder question compared to, we'll just take whatever we want and then, we can always sell it.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions? Chris, I think there's a question from YouTube that you highlighted. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I see two actually that I'm gonna, so Scott Cassim asks a little bit if I can expand a little bit on what I meant by citizenship in space. And I meant that in sort of a general sense, but also a specific one. So the ability to see ourselves in the sky, to create a sense of usness in space and in how we use it, that goes beyond the national. So for instance, right now, 55% of active satellites were licensed by the US FCC in consideration of one country's public interest. But other people maybe should have been in that consideration, or better yet, at the table in a way that would have allowed for maybe a more adequate representation of what is, after all of our skies. It also, I say citizenship in a specific way because it involves rights and also duties. It involves freedom, but also equity, and underlying it is interdependence. And finally, I say citizenship because I think there needs to be a much greater awareness that space governance is happening now. It isn't sci-fi. Rights are being used and abused now. Resources are being used and abused now. Orbits are resources too. So it's not just mining. And the futures that we can imagine are being limited now. A great scholar I know called Natalie Trevino recently wrote about how one of the more kind of insidious colonizations that we have through colonial logic is of the mind. And that is happening now. And then one half point on the parameters for applying international law in space. It's a really complicated question. I'm not saying everything applies right off the bat. We do need to sort of check and see what makes sense to apply. But I'm saying there shouldn't be a barrier there to asking those questions.
So we have just 5 minutes left, Caroline, right? And so I feel like for some people, this was a heavy conversation, and we have to end it to say that there is an emancipatory potential to the work that we do. There is a light at the end of the tunnel that we're trying to get to. So can I give you guys 1 minute to say, from all this that we've talked about, what is the positive outcome that the work that we're doing will lead us to the kinds of future that we think the Space 5.0 future and era will lead us to? So let's start with you, Lucas.
Great question. I think polycentricity can foster more equity by being more inclusive and fostering through that overarching governance system, that rule that involves or authorizes more local stakeholders, that can produce more equity and get those neglected parties and actors into the collective action that is required in space.
Perfect. Thank you. Chris?
I think it's a matter of starting conversations both between fields and between areas of law that are not happening now but should. And then it's also within those conversations training us to think and ask who is here and who is not, and who is speaking and who is not, and how, and not just making that clear as a problem, but then what do we do about it? That I think has a lot of potential. And that's not just for space, but also in how we govern anything.
Natalie?
I think the one thing really at the end of the day is space exploration has so much potential to show us what kind of humans we can be. And the challenges that we're encountering in this can not just reshape or shape the future, but can reshape who we are on this planet. And I think that that's the sort of thing that we need to look for into the future. Is like, we have that hope, like space exploration gives it to us. We just kind of have to utilize it.
And Alessandra?
Yeah, I think my final words would be that I think it's really important to highlight the asymmetries of power at different levels within the space sector, and bring like the strong powers of donors, space agencies closer to communities and different nations closer together in dialogue in a way that kind of changes some of the ways in which the conversations have been held so far.
Thank you. And I think to end it on an inspiring note for me is that I see African youth as the future. I think, Africa is going to be the most populous and youngest, continent. And so what does it mean to reimagine, like, who the visionaries could be of the future, and bringing in, all these young boys and girls who never imagined or never thought that they could be involved, opening it up and letting them take their rightful place, for me, is something hopeful and inspirational. But of course, we have to recognize, because space is a mirror, some people are going to be affected by that change. So not everyone is excited by everyone else's futures. And so, as Lucas said, it's about having conversations where we get to a sense of understanding and get to the sense of saying, these things that we're talking about in the Space 5.0 era are not new things, but the time is now to highlight that perhaps we need to highlight different perspectives and different voices. So the other thing I want you to take away, guys, even though this was a heavy conversation, we're completely pro-space. We think space is inspiring. It's just that it should be inspiring for everyone, not just a couple of people. So thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you so much, all of you, for an awesome panel. I think that there's a lot there. Do you have time for a couple of questions from the audience? Because I see there are a couple in the chat.
Yeah, great. Do you guys have time? Okay, so I think, can we have these people speak? That would be great. John Rummel, it would be great to have you, articulate your points. I think you're talking here about, benefits, and I think if you're there.
Yeah,
hi.
It's so is my 19-month-old.
Beautiful. Hello.
I'm afraid she slept through most of the talks. It's one of those things. But no, I think that the panelists have done a really good job at fleshing out some of the concerns that we all have about the future of humanity and the potential for space to be part of that. I think that when we look at the sorts of pitfalls that are implicit in moving out off of this planet, the Bolivian government is just one of them. There are lots of other governments out there that are selling their legacies for the future to get a couple of things happening at home. And I think about the size of the trucks in Zambia and how amazing they are, at the same time that that's not a forest anymore, it's not a jungle anymore. And what did we lose when we put that aside? I think part of our problem is that we only have Earthside issues. And if you take a look at some of the mining industry, things go from green to brown pretty quickly and not necessarily back again when the mining is over. In space, we don't even know what's valuable yet. I mean, we don't know if you took away all the asteroids in the solar system less than a meter in diameter, would that be a problem? Nobody knows. Nobody runs that kind of model. So I think that it's very important, the work that you guys are doing to bring these sorts of issues forward. And of course, COSPAR, we're hoping to provide scientific expertise that will help people to make informed choices, even if not necessarily the right choice. But we'd like, information is better. We've been working on the biological contamination side for a long time, trying to prevent harmful contamination there. But we started out doing that to protect science. Now we're getting to a point where it's more important to protect it against harmful contamination for lots of other things other than science. And we don't know exactly how to do that yet. So thanks for your inspiring sounds today. And young Hannah appreciated it too. It's her future, you know.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Dallas, you had some points. It would be great to hear from you.
Yeah, I noticed that the concept of sharing the benefits of space equitably came up several times, but how benefit is defined and who defines what benefit is seems like a very complicated issue to get into, and both of who the benefactors are and also what are the timescales on which the benefit is accrued. I know that the scientific, the sort of pure science research community would place a fairly high premium on intellectual benefit and a better understanding of the cosmos. But if you can't get a lot of other people to agree with that, then where do you go from there? That is it just a democratization of things, that however the most people define benefit is the way that we have to go with it, or can special interest groups, which science is definitely one of them, have kind of an outsized say in what the benefit is, like having clean radio frequencies to do our research, and versus the societal and commercial advantages of telecommunication.
So this is a great point, and this was what my PhD thesis was about. So Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty is basically like space should be explored and used for the benefit and interest of all countries. It's like the very first right, legal right to benefit that you have. But of course, by the 1990s, the developing countries were like, we're not seeing benefit. Like, this space is supposed to be benefiting everyone. But there was no conceptualization of what benefit actually meant. So what you found was these polarized viewpoints where the established countries, the USs of the world, would say that by virtue of our existence, there is benefit. So by virtue of the fact that we do stuff, everybody is benefiting. And then the other end of the spectrum would be, unless you can directly benefit me through my interpretation of benefit, then that obligation hasn't been met, which also could be a very difficult and high bar because everyone has an individualized notion. So we had these two extreme, viewpoints, and where along that spectrum is what we do. So what the developing countries did in the 1990s was try to say, let's have a legal regime that will figure out what benefit actually means. And the conclusion of that was a General Assembly resolution called the Space Benefits Declaration that basically said what that Article 1 obligation means is international cooperation. So they define benefit as basically working together. That is the benefit from space. And so if you're a developing country, so long as, we actually give you opportunities to work on projects with us, you are benefiting. But as Alessandra so rightly expressed, that benefit comes down on Earth, and coloniality is all over that process. And so, at the end of the day, it's really, really difficult, like you say, to figure out practically what it should be. And then from the Western side of the Americans, they're so focused on monetary benefits and not sharing those. So it's really like, we don't want a central authority because we don't believe in benefit sharing. We don't believe in the developing countries coming to us, asking us for something for nothing. And I'm like, most people, at least the young Africans that I work with, when they talk about benefit sharing, they're talking about, we need to have a sustainable earth environment. We need active debris removal. So if there's going to be taxes, like collecting money from actors who are launching and creating space debris, the money should be used to clean up space. It's not like, give me money for doing nothing. And so these narratives that we're so used to hearing are really, really skewed. And so, does anyone else have any points? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that, among the first declarations that space even was a commons and that this benefit thing should happen were by scientific unions in the late 50s, the IAU, the IAF, the French and British societies. They were the ones who were at first insisting that space be a commons for scientific purposes. But what's interesting is in like 64 or so, the non-aligned movement made it a point in their agenda, in their Cairo conference. Space benefits as a part of denuclearization. It became very much a thing that the Third World was working on, even long before the Benefits Declaration, which is the most sort of solid idea or understanding of space benefit, the one that is clearest now. But the history is really deep. And that history has weight, both legally but also normatively. The last thing is that the future ambassador to Argentina to the UN committee debating the outer space treaty, A.A. Kaka, wrote an article in 64 where he first proposed this idea of benefit based on Western scholars. And he explicitly said, yes, sharing rewards, but also risks. That sort of, from the Global South perspective, has always been the line. So I think some of this is the idea that it's complicated and therefore we shouldn't get into it has been an idea since the 60s, but also the idea that the one-sidedness of it, I think, is something more perceived by the West than felt by the South.
And Adoli asks, sorry, did you have something to say, Alessandra?
Yeah, just a very small thing, like related to what you both said in terms of what do we understand as benefits. Like, there are different worldviews that come to collide when we are talking about benefits. And when the question is, who's sitting at the table where these conversations are being had? And do we have other mechanisms to ensure participation of non-state actors and not the usual suspects, but non-state actors into these kind of conversations and definitions? And I think that's a really, really big issue, because what you have is basically competing worldview and like Western perspectives kind of like becoming more dominant upon others because, like of these asymmetries of power.
Mm-hmm. I see Adoli asks, are the interests of current non-space actors being factored into the development of the legal regime? Chris, what did you just share in response to that?
And I want to add a little bit to that before, because this is evolving, right? It's been going on for a while, and the Western world has been at the forefront of all of this, and several of the developing countries, especially the African countries, have not been actively involved. Now, telecommunications may be an area where there is some activity when you look at the African continent, but right outside of that, right, the potential militarization or whatever else, mining or whatever, African countries have not really explored that space at all. And all of those are, let's say, income generating potentially, right? So then the fear for me with the legal background is contracting people out, right? Or contracting states out, like the late entrants being contracted out even before they become aware of what they can and cannot do in space. That's a concern. That's a concern for me.
And it's a great point, because what I always say is that, you may not today, even though there are actual resources that are limited, that are like being gobbled up, like Chris talks about the orbit. So for instance, Starlink, which is Elon Musk's internet project, I think they have licenses for something like 40,000 satellites. Those are limited resources to get access to the spectrum of, to be able to communicate with your satellite. And those are allocated by country. So if one actor has access to spectrum for like 40,000 satellites, and remembering that there's only about 2,000 or 3,000 operational satellites in orbit today, that's significant. So there's resources that we need to safeguard today, but the resources for tomorrow, like space forces, like military arms of the government are being established to protect space assets. That means something must be there. So even if you're not ready to go there today, you've got to get your young people to be thinking about it so that by the time, the technology is there and we're ready for exploitation, we will have people in our region, in Africa, in developing countries, etc., who at least have some competency and can actually be part of the conversation. But I think there's a role for everyone today on the governance level, because even if you're not technologically savvy, you have enough historical context of exploitation and domination to know that you need to safeguard your rights now. Like no one's going to safeguard them for you. And we can't expect these big actors to be altruistic because they also have to protect themselves, rightfully so. So it's incumbent on us as Africans, for instance, to get ourselves together and say, yes, we may not be able to access all these resources today, but at least let's start thinking about what that would look like. And let's start prioritizing this because it's actually not that far in the future. The Artemis program for the US going to the moon is basically 2025. And going to the moon looking for resources to develop an in situ resource utilization and using the moon as a gateway into deep space. So like these things sound like science fiction, but they're science fact. I mean, they're happening right now.
If I could quickly jump in to add, the president of Liberia, William Tubman, made a speech in 1966, which is really, really beautifully categorizes this exact issue of like, the skies are all ours, you guys can't ruin them for us. So sort of soon before we've had a chance to explore that. Same with the ambassador of India. And again, it haunts me that that was said in 1966, and now we're here again. Still saying that, and sort of how do we make sure that people aren't there in the future saying that? Something I'm also wanting to flag quickly is as space becomes more crowded, especially LEO in low Earth orbit, if we need artificial intelligence that to a quite advanced level that hasn't been invented yet to manage the traffic that will be present in the future, just to exist there, what barrier does that create for like a university CubeSat or the first attempts of a non-spacefaring country trying to access space? Because suddenly the sort of toolkit you need to operate and survive is substantially bigger, and that starts to harm the freedom to use outer space, which is the one part of OST Article 1 people seem to agree on.
Excellent. So if there are are there any other final questions from the audience? Can you see anything on YouTube?
No, I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. So join me once again in thanking everyone on the panel. This was amazing. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.